Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my Romantasy predictions for the Goodreads Choice Awards. Alright guys, so if you're unfamiliar with the Goodreads Choice Awards, it is an annual award program that if a book was published within the year and has over a 3 or 3.5 rating on Goodreads, it is eligible to be nominated, and it's actually broken down by genre. So I believe they start with 20 books, and then slowly as you vote, it gets dwindled down until there is one winner. So last year they added a romantasy category, and I'm really hoping they keep it up for this year. I feel like fantasy romance and romantasy has really grown over the last 2 years, and I absolutely love that they finally added that category. Now, with that being said, I've never posted one of these videos before, and that is because I am notoriously bad at guessing the books that Goodreads is going to nominate, especially with the first round. I feel like this has a lot to do with me reading primarily indie-published fantasy romance, and a lot of the Goodreads that are nominated are typically trad pub, which I don't read nearly as much of unless they were indie and turned trad. But with all that out of the way, I am so excited to talk about these books with you guys. I have 20 fantasy romance books that I'm going to talk about. I will give a very brief, spoiler-free synopsis of every book, and if I have not read the book, I'll just give you an idea about what the book is about. And if you are unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram, Goodreads, and Patreon, all linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about these predictions. And I forgot to mention in the intro that this list is going to be in no particular order, but I will be saving the top 5 books for the very end, including the book that I'm almost positive will end up winning the entire romantasy category. So starting off, we have the Wren in the Holly Library. So in this story, we are following Kierce, and she lives in a world where monsters and humans have come to this almost like peace agreement. However, there is still a lot of animosity between the two sides. So one day, Kierce, who is a brilliant thief, ends up breaking into this library only to discover that it's actually inhabited and owned by a monster named Graves. Now, Graves, instead of immediately killing Kierce, realizes that she has some potential and asks that she help him steal an item that he has been searching for, and in return, he will not kill her immediately. And the story goes from there. This book is filled with Celtic mythology and also has a lot of nods to Beauty and the Beast. And I really, really enjoyed it despite putting it off of so many TBRs. Now, once again, I am unsure if this is actually going to be picked. However, I did think it was really fun and it had a lot of popularity when it first released. So I definitely think it is a contender. And this next book, unfortunately, I have not read yet. However, it was on my most anticipated reads of 2024 list. So it is Bloodguard. Now, in this fantasy romance, we are following Gray, who is currently serving as a gladiator in order to try to save his dying sister. He is then offered a choice by this elven princess that he can become a Bloodguard and go through the trials that are associated with that. And the story goes from there. Now, I do think this will be nominated. However, the fact that this book recently released is really going to go against it. So I'm not sure how far into the round it's going to go, but I do think it has a pretty solid likelihood of being selected in the first round. And next up, we have The Crimson Moth, also known as Heartless Hunter. This is a YA fantasy romance, so I'm not positive if it's going to be included. However, it is enemies to lovers, witch hunter, so I feel like it does have a pretty good likelihood, and there was a ton of special edition book boxes that featured this book. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, we are following Rune, and she is a witch. However, in this community, witches are actually hunted and killed. So she is pretending to be a vapid socialite. However, on top of all of this, she is also a vigilante who at night is trying to save other witches from being purged. So one night when a rescue goes wrong, our main character Rune decides to try to throw everyone off her trail by pretending to court Gideon, who is one of like the top witch hunters. And the story goes from there. So overall, I did enjoy this book, not quite enough to pick up the sequel, but it was really fun. It kind of reminded me of Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahern. So I'm very curious to see if this does make the Goodreads Choice Awards. And next up is yet another book that unfortunately I have not read yet. It is Heavenbreaker. Now, I believe this released back in May, and there were a lot of special editions for this book as well, which is why I believe that it will be nominated. Now, this book is following a young woman that I believe is trying to dismantle the current hierarchy and noble houses that are at play, and ends up wielding this machine known as Heavenbreaker that was used in past conflicts, and I think this machine harbors some sort of dark entity or malevolent force, and the story goes from there. So it sounds really interesting. I'm hoping I can get to it by the end of 2024, but I'm very curious to see if it makes the nominee list. And next up, we have The Veiled Kingdom by Holly Renee. So in this story, we are following Nyra, and she is a princess, and her father, the king, is horribly abusive and just a terrible individual. So when Nyra ends up trying to flee from her father, she gets captured by this rebellion who don't realize who she is and essentially give her an ultimatum: either she joins the rebellion or is killed. So she begrudgingly joins and then has to work for this rebellion, all while trying to keep her identity a secret, specifically from the son of the rebellion leader, Dacre, who has taken quite an interest in her, and the story goes from there. Now, I am positive this will be nominated. I just don't know how far it's going to get into the rounds. So I've seen a lot of people not love the sequel to this book. I still haven't picked it up because I've been hearing so many negative reviews. But overall, this was a very solid and fun fantasy romance. It's definitely my favorite by Holly Renee. So I'm hoping that this at least gets nominated. I'm pretty sure it will be, but we will see. Okay, so this next book is 100% wishful thinking on my part. I honestly don't think it's going to be selected, but I really hope it is, because this was one of the most unique fantasy romances I read this year. So it is What Did You Do?, which is the sequel to How Does It Feel? Now, I believe How Does It Feel was released last year, so it can't be nominated, but I'm really hoping the sequel is. Although I did prefer this book a little bit more, I still really enjoyed the sequel, and I'm very curious to see where the story goes. So if you're unfamiliar with How Does It Feel, we are following this girl named Callie that when she was very young, she believed she saw a fae. And because of this, she's been obsessed with winged creatures ever since. So she grows up and becomes, I think, a biologist or something like that, and studies these moths. And when she's searching for a specific endangered moth, she ends up falling down a portal into the Unseelie court, where she is almost killed multiple times by Prince Mendex, who is the king of the Unseelie court, and he has all of these dark and dangerous creatures that he controls, and it was overall just such a fun and unique read. I really enjoyed it. There is a tree monster. Maybe check trigger warnings. It is very, very interesting and just not something I ever thought I would read, but overall, I really love this book, so I'm really hoping the sequel makes it onto the Goodreads Choice Awards. And next up is another continuation of a series. We have A Touch of Chaos, which is book 7 in the Hades and Persephone series by Scarlett St. Clair. Now, I've only read the first 2 books in this series. However, I really want to go back and do a reread and then continue. So I honestly have no idea what is going on with these characters at this point. The first book is an urban fantasy based off of Hades and Persephone, and I really enjoyed it. From what I remember, Hades, I think, owned a gambling ring, and I think Persephone was a news reporter or something like that. But overall, I'm very curious. Now, I do think this will be nominated just because Scarlett St. Clair, I feel like, is typically at least one of her books are nominated, and this is a very beloved series. I don't think it's going to be the winner, but it should at least make the first round. And next up is The Games Gods Play. So in this story, we are following a cursed office clerk who is currently residing in San Francisco, and San Francisco is being ruled by Zeus. So she is just trying to get through life, keep her head down, but that becomes impossible when she is noticed by Hades, and Hades decides to enter her in the Crucible. So the Crucible is this, I think, tournament to the death, where the different gods will pick human proxies to fight in their stead, and then they figure out a ruler by whoever is the sole survivor, and the story goes from there. Or that is what I gathered from the Goodreads plot synopsis. But this book is solely on this list because it is a Red Tower book, and I feel like Red Tower books gain so much popularity, specifically because of the marketing and the gorgeous sprayed edges, so I feel like there is a high likelihood that this will be entered into the nominations. And next up is 5 Broken Blades. Now, I believe the story is following 5 master liars, partially comprised of a assassin seeking redemption, a hitman, and a disgraced prince, who have been summoned to assassinate a tyrannical king who is allowing the nobles to rule over the poor class. Now, only 1 out of the 5 can rule, so I believe this story is filled with a lot of politics, maneuvering, deceit, and it just sounds really good. Despite the fact I had no idea this book existed until I was researching for this video. So the only reason I added this book to this list is because it was a Book of the Month book, and when I was looking at the winners or the nominees from last year, a lot of those books were Book of the Month books. So I feel like this has a pretty high likelihood of being nominated, and it does have a lot of very positive reviews, so hopefully I will be reading this book soon. And next up is The Spellshop. Now, this is a cozy fantasy romance following Keela and her sentient spider plant named Kaz. They were living in this magical library until a revolution caused the library to burn down, and Keela and Kaz had to flee. So they go to Keela's childhood home, where she never thought she would return, and they end up meeting her grumpy neighbor, and I believe there is a romance between them. And the story goes from there. Now, this book was unbelievably popular at the beginning of October. Now, it hasn't been out for very long, so I'm not sure if it will be nominated, but because of the amount of popularity, I'm pretty sure it has a pretty good chance. And next up is Phantasma. Now, I will completely lose it if this makes it onto the nominee list. I adored this book. It is perfect for spooky season. And if you're a fan of Caraval by Stephanie Garber, this is like a much darker Gothic version. And I was obsessed with this book when I read it. So the story is following Ophelia, and when her mother ends up suddenly dying, she inherits her mother's necromancy abilities. Now, when her mother passes away, she soon finds out that her and her sister are possibly going to lose the house they live in because of money issues. So the sister takes it upon herself to join Phantasma, which is this deadly competition based on the different levels of hell, where you have to survive and be the sole survivor in order to have a wish granted. So when Ophelia finds out her sister has entered this competition, she decides she will enter as well to try to save her sister, and the story goes from there. And the main rule is do not fall in love in Phantasma. This also has mental health, OCD, and intrusive thought rep, and I just thought it was done so beautifully. So I would, once again, be thrilled if this makes the Goodreads list. I just don't know. It did release pretty late in the year, and I don't know if it will actually be selected, but I really, really hope that it is. And of course, I had to include at least one Jennifer L. Armentrout book on this list, so we have Born of Blood and Ash. Now, I believe this is book 4 in the Flesh and Fire series, which is the companion series to From Blood and Ash. I am not caught up on that series. I still have to read book 3, so I have no idea what is happening in book 4. However, it does have pretty good reviews, and the From Blood and Ash series is one of my favorite fantasy romance series of all time. It is really one of the series that rekindled my love of reading and introduced me to fantasy romance, that and ACOTAR. So I really hope that it does get nominated. Now, I don't know if it'll win because it is the 4th book in a series, but overall, I love essentially everything Jennifer L. Armentrout writes. All right, so this next book I actually DNF'd, and honestly, I don't think it should be on the list, but because of the author, I think there's a very good chance that it will be nominated. So it's The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. I wouldn't consider this romantasy. However, once again, because of Leigh Bardugo's name, I think there is a good chance that it will be selected. But this story is following a girl who I believe, from what I remember, works as a servant, and she has the ability to use this small magic, and her mistress ends up making her use this magic in order to climb the social ladder, and then she's discovered by someone very close to the king who wants to use her for his own gain, and I believe there's a war that starts brewing, and it goes from there. I DNF'd this very early in. I know my friend Issa was reading it and also wasn't a huge fan, so once she wasn't really feeling it, I also decided to DNF. Now, I do want to go back and read this. If you've read this, please let me know, what did you rate it? Because I have had a couple friends rate this pretty high, so I'm interested if I should have kept going. But what do you guys think? Do you think this will be one of the nominees? I'm really curious. And next up is Fear the Flames by Olivia Rose Darling. Now, the only reason this is not in my top 5 of books I am positive will be included is because I am not sure if this book can actually be nominated, because originally it released in 2022. However, it was picked up by a trad publisher who ended up changing and omitting and editing a ton, and re-released this September. So I really think it should be included because it's essentially a different book, but it does have all of the same characters, same plot, everything like that. So I am not really sure, but this was one of my top fantasy romances of the year. It has dragons, it has, not enemies to lovers, more like reluctant allies to lovers, but overall, I just loved this story. So if you're unfamiliar, in this story, we are following Owen, and she was this princess that ended up being bonded with dragons, and there was a prophecy that a princess who bonded with dragons could spell doom for this kingdom. It could also be like the most prosperous kingdom ever, but because the king is like apparently very negative, he decided to go with the bad version, and he ends up locking up his daughter. So she is able to escape and actually starts her own kingdom, but she is missing her dragons. So she ends up teaming up with the rival of her father in order to have this heist and try to get these dragons back. And it's their story. It has the found family trope. It is just such an enjoyable read. So highly recommend if you have not read this yet, but I really, really hope they choose to include it in the Goodreads Choice Awards. And we have made it to the final 5. Now, these are the 5 books I am positive will make it onto the Goodreads Choice Awards and possibly even win. I actually did organize these in terms of where I think they will rank. And once again, I am notoriously bad at guessing who will win the Goodreads Choice Awards, but I am almost positive I know who is going to win this year. So starting off, we have Quicksilver by Callie Hart. This book has become so unbelievably popular. The audiobook finally released. I am currently in the middle of reading this book, and it is worth all of the hype. I am absolutely loving it. The banter is perfection, and this story hooks you immediately. So without giving away spoilers, the story is essentially following this girl who, after having some very upsetting things happen to her, in order to save her life, she accidentally opens a realm into this other kind of wintry world where she becomes bonded to a fae known as Kingfisher, and it is their story. It goes from there, but once again, I am absolutely loving this. Now, the only thing I'm kind of worried about is I believe this book is unbelievably popular, but while I was looking at Goodreads, it does not have nearly as many reviews as I thought it would have. So we will see. That is why it's last on my top 5, because I'm not sure how popular it really is. But overall, I absolutely adore this book, and I am so excited to gush about it in my wrap-up, so I'm hoping to finish it by the end of the week. And next up, we have A Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle L. Jensen. This is a Norse-inspired fantasy romance, and we are following Freya, who is currently in an unwanted marriage to her husband. Now, this is because her husband is able to have this god gift where he can, I believe, lure fish or do something to help the community, so she was essentially forced to marry him. Now, these two really do not get along, and this becomes unbelievably apparent when her husband betrays her and forces Freya to fight to the death against this Viking warrior. Now, what no one else realizes is Freya actually has a drop of goddess blood that allows her to repel any attack. So when she uses this magic to save her life, the Vikings become very interested in her and want to use her in their war. So the story goes from there. I will say the end of this definitely gave me From Blood and Ash vibes, and I really enjoyed it. I pretty much love everything Danielle L. Jensen writes, but I know this gained a lot of popularity. It has a ton of good reviews, so I'm pretty positive this is going to make it onto the list. And next up we have When the Moon Hatched by Sara A. Parker. This is another top fantasy romance read of the year for me, so I'm really hoping it makes it onto the Goodreads Choice Awards, but I know a lot of people really ended up loving this story, and I do a terrible job of trying to summarize it. But we're essentially following this girl who is part of this rebellion that is trying to take down a certain group. And when she is doing this, she ends up being captured and put into this cell. While all this is going on, there is a prince of another kingdom who is searching for shards of dragons that had fallen from the sky. And while doing so, he ends up finding our main character in this prison. And together, they end up going off on this other adventure. And the story goes from there. That is a very basic summary of this book. So much happens. The writing is very verbose, very whimsical. I definitely had to listen to the audiobook and follow along with the physical book, at least in the very beginning until I got used to the writing style. But overall, I just love Sara A. Parker's writing. I feel like it's always kind of like a little puzzle that you have to solve, which makes me enjoy the book so much more. So overall, if you have not read this, highly, highly recommend. And that brings us to the final 2. Now, I will say this next book I honestly don't believe should be part of the romantasy category. It is very much a paranormal romance. However, unfortunately, I do think it's going to be included and take a lot of votes from other fantasy romance books. So it is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. Now, I am actually someone that had a very fun time with this story. I really enjoyed it. I just don't believe it is fantasy romance. So this story is essentially just following a vampire who is in an arranged marriage with a werewolf in order to align their two people and to kind of keep this like diplomatic peace going. And the story really goes from there. I think it's a very good intro to Omegaverse. And overall, I thought it was really fun. I just really, really hope it doesn't get nominated because once again, I do see this more as paranormal than fantasy romance. And that brings us to the book that I believe will win the entire Romantasy category. We have House of Flame and Shadow, the third book in the Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas. Now, if you are familiar with my channel, then you know I was not a fan of this book overall. Honestly, I didn't like the second book, and this third book I liked slightly more, but still, just overall as a series, I felt like it was very weak in comparison to Throne of Glass and A Court of Thorns and Roses. I feel like this third book in particular had quite a tone shift where it felt very sci-fi. Also, I didn't really love any of the characters besides two, and unfortunately, they were not the main characters. I would read an entire book of those two characters and their romance, and I'm really hoping that is what Sarah J. Maas plans on doing in future books that are set in the Crescent City world. But overall, this really didn't work for me. However, because it is Sarah J. Maas, the queen of fantasy romance, I do believe that this book will be the overall winner. Alright guys, those are my Romantasy predictions for the Goodreads Choice Awards. Please let me know down in the comments below. Do you agree with my picks? Are there any books that I did not include that you think will be nominated? And I'd like to say a special thank you to my Paladin protectors, Amanda, Erin, Leslie, Kat, and Lotta. Thank you guys so much for supporting my channel. And I said this already, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday, and if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye!